The Galactic Tribunal had existed for 11,000 years. It was not the oldest institution in known space. The Valith Compact predated it by 4 centuries, and the Tessari Synod had been dissolving and reconstituting itself for 14,000 years before anyone thought to write down the dates. But the tribunal was the largest, the loudest, and the most certain of itself, and in a galaxy where certainty was the currency of power, that made it the institution that mattered. On the morning the ultimatum was drafted, 61 species were represented in the Great Hall of Conclave Station Aurelius. The station floated at the gravitational midpoint of 3 star systems, a position chosen 3,000 years ago by a committee that had spent 40 years on the calculation and then built the station in 11. The Great Hall had been carved from pale moon rock by 200,000 workers over 17 years, not because it needed to be carved from pale moon rock, but because the tribunal had understood from its earliest sessions that a species made to feel small in a room was a species more likely to sign what was put in front of it. The ceiling was a dome of translucent stone 300 meters overhead. The far walls were hidden behind a soft blue haze. The air carried the sharp chemical tang of 61 different breathing mixes filtered into something that none of the species present found comfortable, and all of them could survive, another deliberate choice, made by the same committee 3,000 years ago. Veldrathis stood at the central platform. He was Korathi, broad-shouldered, gray-scaled, built like a species that had been winning ground wars since before most of the chamber's current members had developed agriculture. The ceremonial campaign markings of 44 conquered worlds were pressed in silver into the skin of his left forearm, a record so long it had required 3 separate application ceremonies. He had been the tribunal's supreme war architect for 12 years. Before that, he had written the tactical doctrine that ended the Breathian expansion in 14 days, a conflict that the Breathian hive had expected to last 6 years. Before that, he had studied under the last Korathi war architect, a female named Drev Sothan, who had taken 9 worlds in 40 years and died at 94 without having lost a single engagement. Veldrathis was 61 years old. He had never lost a campaign. He did not expect to begin now. He activated the projection above his platform. The data was clean, organized, color-coded in tribunal standard formats. He had prepared it himself over 9 data cycles, cross-referencing 4 independent intelligence sources and running the output through 3 separate verification models. "We have reviewed Earth's military posture comprehensively," he said. His voice was calm. "Our projections account for 165 distinct engagement scenarios. These cover every variable we have been able to observe or reasonably infer: fleet positioning, response time, technological capability, coalition possibility, and historical precedent." He paused. A small indicator light confirmed the projection had loaded on every delegate's display. "In all 165 scenarios, the outcome is the same. Earth will comply or Earth will cease. The probability of Korathi loss in any modeled scenario is 0.003%. The margin of error in our models is smaller than that." He set down his notes. "We have accounted for everything." In the highest row of the chamber, Elder Narath Solus of the Valith watched him. She was 580 years old. Her species, the Valith, were small and pale and had been part of the tribunal for 2,200 years, long enough to have watched 7 other species present their certainty in this chamber with exactly the same quiet confidence. She had been the Valith's senior delegate for 61 years. She had watched all 7 of those confident presentations end. In 3 of the 7 cases, the species doing the presenting had not survived the outcome. She said nothing during Drathas's presentation. When the vote was called, she voted no. She was one of 4 delegates who did. She did not explain her vote. Grand Speaker Osiv Tal of the Fenari, 71 years old, smooth-voiced, the kind of institutional creature who had spent so long inside the tribunal's machinery that he had forgotten there was a purpose to it, announced the result. 387 votes in favor, 4 against, 11 abstentions. The resolution passed. The Korathi enforcement action against Earth's outer system installations was authorized under Compact Authority 7. He read it as if he were announcing a zoning adjustment. Drathis returned to his seat. One of his aides leaned close and said something. Drathis smiled once briefly and nodded. He picked up a small flat tablet from the table beside him and made a brief notation. Narath Solus watched him from the highest row. She had not explained her vote because she had not known the specifics. She had voted no for the same reason she had voted no 7 times in 61 years whenever a species stood at that platform, and used the phrase, "We have accounted for everything." In 61 years of watching, she had never seen that sentence followed by anything good. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the cold stars through the translucent dome. She thought humans have been quiet for a long time. She thought that is not what weakness looks like. She said nothing. The vote was recorded. The chamber began to empty. The ultimatum reached Earth Defense Station Pale Anchor 19 days later, transmitted on a standard tribunal diplomatic channel at 3:12 station time, formatted as a routine administrative communication. It was 4 paragraphs long. Grand Speaker Asif Tal had signed it. The language was bureaucratic and flat and ugly in the specific way that bureaucratic language is always ugly when it is describing something that is going to hurt people, not inflammatory, not dramatic, but precise in the way that removes all possibility of misunderstanding while also removing all possibility of dignity. The tribunal, acting under Compact Authority 7, has determined that Earth's failure to register its outer system assets within 4 consecutive administrative cycles constitutes an administrative noncompliance event. Earth will transfer operational authority of all outer system installations, including but not limited to deep range monitoring stations, orbital defense platforms, and all unmanned assets beyond the orbit of the 8th planet, within 30 standard days. Noncompliance with this directive will be formally reclassified as territorial aggression against tribunal member species. Korathi enforcement assets have been prepositioned in the relevant sectors. A representative of the Korathi War Command will contact Earth Defense Command within 72 hours to coordinate the transfer. We thank you for your cooperation in this matter. It was not a declaration of war. It was a filing. Admiral Senna Crow was reading it in a folding chair in a room that smelled like recycled air and cold iron. The room was on the 3rd subfloor of Pale Anchor's operations hub, 14 meters below the station's main deck, with no windows and a ceiling low enough that the taller members of her staff had learned to duck when they moved between the support columns. It was not a glamorous room. It was the right room, close to the signal relays, close to the tactical center, and far enough from the station's public areas that the conversations held in it tended not to travel. Crow was 54 years old. She had short-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that answered questions slowly and correctly. She had been in Earth Unified Command for 26 years, 3 border arbitrations, 1 enforcement action, 1 actual war that had lasted 4 years and left 11,000 people dead on both sides, and then a long silence, and then 14 months of something she was not yet allowed to name. She read the filing twice. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. Commander Yale Oduya was standing to her right, watching the Korathi deployment vectors on a 9-meter tactical display that covered the entire east wall of the room. He was 41, lean, with 19 years of fleet service behind him and the specific quality of stillness that people develop when they have spent 2 decades watching situations get worse before they get better. He had been looking at the display for 3 minutes before he said anything. "They're showing us 1,400 ships," he said finally. "I know," Crow said. "Fleet breakdown, 280 capital class, 460 support, 380 troop transports, 280 mixed." "I know. They prepositioned before the ultimatum. That staging started 14 months ago." "I know," Crow said again. Oduya looked at her. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded on the table. Her face had not changed. "They're trying to make us panic," he said, not a question. "Yes. Is it working?" Crow said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Get me Captain Dietz." LT, Specialist Rana Fell, was 29 years old and had been stationed at the signals monitoring post on the edge of Jupiter's shadow for 14 months. Her post was a small structure, 6 rooms, 12 staff, a pair of long-range arrays pointed at the outer system's entry corridors. She had filed 9 reports about the Korathi prepositioning movements. The reports had been received, logged, and acknowledged by Earth Defense Command within 72 hours each time. None of them had been answered. She had assumed they were being ignored. She had been wrong about that. 3 days after the ultimatum arrived, a message came through from Pale Anchor. It was addressed to her specifically, signed by Admiral Crowe, and consisted of 7 words. "Good work. Stand by. You'll understand soon." Fell read it 3 times. She set it down. She looked out the small porthole at the dark between Jupiter and the outer system's boundary, a vast, quiet stretch of space that had looked empty for the entire 14 months she had been watching it. She had begun to suspect it was not actually empty. 2 days later, on Conclave Station Aurelius, Elder Narath Solus requested a private meeting with the Tribunal's Records Division. She spent 7 hours reviewing historical engagement files, specifically, the records of every species that had been absorbed into the Tribunal in the last 500 years. She was looking for something. She found it in the records of 6 different absorptions. In each case, in the period before the Tribunal's formal ultimatum, there had been a brief increase in the target species' long-range signals activity. In 5 of the 6 cases, that activity had been dismissed as noise or routine communication. In the 6th case, it had been flagged, and then the flag had been closed when the engagement was deemed too advanced to change course. She left the Records Division at 1900 station time. She did not go back to her quarters. She went instead to a small observation alcove on the station's north side, where the dome was thinnest and the stars were clearest, and she stood there for a long time looking in the direction of Earth's solar system. She was thinking about silence, not the silence of emptiness, the other kind. Operation Stillwater had begun 47 years ago. It was not in any tribunal registry. It was not in any diplomatic disclosure. It had no formal announcement, no naming ceremony, no recorded founding date. It had been funded through 12 separate infrastructure programs with names that communicated nothing to anyone who did not already know what they were looking for. Atmospheric monitoring expansion, deep-range survey continuation, long-duration habitat maintenance, orbital debris management, solar observation network update. Each program had its own budget. Each budget was real. Each program produced the work it claimed to produce. The other thing each program produced, the ships, the platforms, the relay stations, the weapon systems, was produced in 6 dispersed construction yards positioned in the dark between planetary systems, in orbits chosen specifically because they fell outside the survey patterns of every known tribunal observation network. The committee that drafted the Black Charter had met 47 years ago in a conference room on a station that no longer existed. There had been 7 people in the room. They had spent 6 days reviewing the tribunal's history, every absorption, every enforcement action, every species that had been given an ultimatum, every species that had complied, and every species that had not. They had looked at what the tribunal's ultimatums had in common. They had looked at what the species that survived had in common. The document they produced was 14 pages long. Its first sentence was, "If it ever comes, it will come fast, and it will come certain of itself, and the only correct response is to have been ready before it arrives." Its second sentence was, "We begin now." The Black Charter had been kept active through 11 changes of government, 3 full reorganizations of Earth Unified Command, 1 actual war with a non-tribunal species, and 6 separate tribunal inspections of Earth's declared military assets. In 47 years, it had never been leaked. The 7 original committee members had all been dead for at least 20 years. The program's current custodian was a woman named Adora Sen, who was 68 years old and had been running Stillwater's logistics division for 22 years, without once being asked to explain what she was doing to anyone outside the program. By the time Osif Tal read the filing into the tribunal's record, Operation Stillwater had produced 380 capital-class warships, distributed across 6 dispersal columns in Earth's outer system. 44 orbital defense platforms seated along the 12 entry corridors any aggressor would naturally use when approaching Earth's solar system. Each platform calibrated specifically to Korathi shield harmonics. A technical detail sourced from 31 years of quiet signals monitoring, and 3 years of reverse engineering work on a piece of Korathi equipment that had been quietly acquired 11 years earlier through channels the tribunal did not need to know about. 1,100 interdiction mines distributed through the Jupiter debris field in a pattern that looked, on any standard scan, like the natural distribution of metallic debris. 22 long-range relay stations, positioned to give Earth Defense Command real-time visibility of every object in a 40 light-minute radius around the solar system's outer boundary. a communications disruption network that could, on activation, isolate any fleet entering the outer system from contact with any external signals within 4 minutes of the order being given. And one warship that was not part of the 380. The S-Caretaker was the lead ship of Column 1. Captain Marin Dietz had commanded it for 9 years. She was 47 years old with 24 years of fleet service and a face that her crew described, privately, as the kind of face that makes you feel like whatever you're worried about, she already handled it last week. She had short, dark hair and the habit of arriving at her command station 20 minutes before her shift and spending those 20 minutes reading old engagement reports. Not current intelligence, not recent operations, but reports from conflicts 30, 40, 50 years old, the kind that reminded her how outcomes developed over time. She had a photograph of a brown dog pinned to the frame above her navigation console. The dog's name had been Anchor. He had died 7 years ago at the age of 14. She had pinned the photograph the day after and had not taken it down since. She had run the Stillwater engagement simulation 206 times in 9 years. She had found 4 scenarios in the early runs where the Column 1 response time was 18 seconds too slow. She had fixed them in year 3. In the last 140 simulations, she had found nothing. She had run 140 more anyway. When Crow's order came through, not a speech, not a declaration, not a ceremony of any kind, just a 4-word fleet signal that had been waiting for 47 years to be sent. Stillwater. All columns move. Dietz reached up and straightened the photograph of the dog. She did this the same way she did everything, without drama, without announcement, with the particular economy of motion that comes from having decided something a long time ago and having nothing left to decide. Then she turned to her navigation officer and said, "Take us out." Across the outer system, in 6 dispersal columns that had been holding position for 14 months, 380 ships began to move. They moved quietly. They did not broadcast. They did not use active sensors. They navigated by the relay network and by the positions they had calculated and recalculated for 47 years, and they moved into the geometry that the Black Charter had specified on its 4th page, in a diagram that was now 47 years old and had been updated 14 times as the intelligence picture changed. The geometry was simple. It did not look simple on a tactical display. What it looked like on a tactical display was a door closing. In the Coalition chamber on Conclave Station, 3 of the 6 species that had been quietly training with Earth's fleet for 11 cycles were represented by observers who had been told nothing, and were watching the Korathi fleet's deployment with expressions that the other delegates read as indifference. The Valith observer was not indifferent. He was 34 years old, junior enough that nobody watched his face. He was watching the long-range sensors and he was running a calculation in his head, not a military calculation. He had no military training. A different kind of calculation. He was counting how long the Korathi had been prepositioning. He was counting the gap between that start date and the date of the tribunal authorization. He was looking at that gap, 14 months before the authorization, not after, and he was thinking about what it meant to preposition a fleet before you have authorization to use it. It meant you were certain you would get the authorization. He looked at the Korathi delegation across the chamber. Veldrathis was conferring with 2 of his aides, calm, unhurried, the posture of a commander who is not worried about what comes next. The young Valith observer thought, what would make a species that certain? He thought, what would make a species that certain wrong? He sent a message to Elder Narath Solis. It was 3 words, "What do you know?" Her reply came back in 6 minutes. "Not enough. Watch the outer boundary." Veldrathis' forward scout reached the solar system's outer boundary at 400 station time. It was a fast, lightly armed reconnaissance vessel, one of 12 that Drathis had deployed 72 hours ahead of the main fleet as standard doctrine. The scout was crewed by 14 Korathi officers. Its orders were to confirm the entry corridor was clear and relay that confirmation back before the main fleet committed to its approach vector. At 4:01, the scout's sensors registered 380 contacts. The contacts were not moving aggressively. They were not broadcasting threats. They were positioned in a pattern that the scout's tactical officer needed 22 seconds to process before she understood what she was looking at. At 4:02, the scout's communications officer opened a channel back to the Korathi flagship. At 4:02 and 14 seconds, the channel was severed by Earth's communications disruption network. The scout had transmitted one word before the channel closed: something. On the Korathi flagship, Veldrathis looked at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back at him. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Get me that scout," Drathis said. "We've lost the signal, Commander." "Then get me any signal from that sector." The communications officer worked for 11 seconds. "There's nothing, Commander. It's the sector's gone quiet." Drathis looked at the tactical display. The main fleet was 40 minutes behind the scout, fully committed to its approach vector. He looked at his fleet admiral. His fleet admiral was looking at the display. "Do we have any external contacts reading in that sector?" Drathis asked. "No, sir. Our relay network shows the corridor as clear." Drathis looked at the display for a long time. He thought about 165 scenarios. He thought about 0.003%. He thought about the word, something, hanging unfinished in the communications record. He made a decision. It was the wrong one, but it was the decision his 12 years of doctrine and his 44 conquered worlds and his 165 scenarios had trained him to make. He held his course. The fleet was already committed. The corridor was showing clear. The scout had lost communications. That happened. Equipment failed. It was not a reason to abort an operation this size. He held his course. 40 minutes later, the main Korathi fleet crossed the outer boundary. They did not fire. That was the first thing Veldrathis understood, and it was the thing that should have told him everything he needed to know. The 380 contacts on his display, appearing simultaneously as his fleet crossed the outer boundary, did not fire. They held position. They maintained formation. They did nothing that looked like an attack. They looked like walls. His fleet entered in the standard Korathi approach formation: 3 advance columns, 2 flanking wings, 1 reserve positioned 80,000 kilometers behind the primary engagement zone. It was a formation optimized for opponents with less than 200 capital ships. Drathis had used it in 9 campaigns. It had worked in all 9. Column 1 of the Black War Fleet did not fire. It held position directly ahead of the Korathi advance and completed the geometry of the north face. Column 2 did not fire. It moved to seal the south corridor behind the Korathi reserve. Column 3 moved to the east. Column 4 to the west. Column 5 completed the upper geometry. Column 6, the smallest column, 40 ships, positioned 14 months ago in a location that the Korathi prepositioning intelligence had not covered, sealed the lower corridor that the Korathi flanking wings would have used to break contact. It took 9 minutes. The 44 orbital defense platforms came online at the 6-minute mark. They did not fire either. They oriented. Every Korathi ship in the formation had a platform with a firing solution. Drathis's tactical officers identified this at the 7-minute mark and reported it. Drathis was already looking at the display. He did not need the report. He had run 165 scenarios. He had no scenario that looked like this. "Fleet Admiral," he said. "Sir, what is our exit corridor?" A pause. "We are assessing, sir." "Don't assess. Tell me which exit corridor is open." Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, the south corridor is sealed, the upper corridor is sealed, the east and west corridors." Another pause. "They're all sealed, sir. We have contact coverage on all 6 potential exit vectors." Drathis looked at the display. He thought they moved before we crossed the boundary. They were already in position. He thought 165 scenarios. None of them looked like this. He thought we prepositioned 14 months ago. They knew. He said, "Open a communications channel to the human command ship." "Which ship, sir? We're not reading a command ship designation from any of the contacts." "Any ship, the nearest ship, any frequency they'll answer." His communications officer tried. It took 40 seconds. The channel opened. The voice that came through was a woman's. It was calm. It was not cold. It was not the performed coldness of a species trying to project power. It was simply the voice of someone who was not surprised by any of what was happening and who had run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. "Commander Drathis," Admiral Senna Crow said, "I understand you wanted to reach us." Drathis held his position. His 1,400 ships held position. The 380 contacts around them held position. The 44 platforms held their firing solutions. "You built this before we filed the ultimatum," he said. "We built this 47 years ago," Crow said. "We've been updating it since." A silence, 4 seconds. "The 165 scenarios," Drathai said. "We know about the scenarios," Crow said. "We've been watching your modeling methodology for 31 years. You have very good models, Commander. They don't have a 166th scenario because you built them to account for everything you've observed. We made sure you hadn't observed some things." Drathais looked at his tactical display. At his 1,400 ships surrounded by 380 contacts that had not fired. At 44 platforms that had firing solutions and had not used them. "What do you want?" he said. Crow said, "We want what we've always wanted. We want to be left alone." A pause. "We are going to open your south corridor. One ship at a time, you are going to take your fleet home. When your fleet is home, you are going to tell the tribunal what you found here. And then the tribunal is going to make a decision about whether Earth's outer system assets are still an administrative non-compliance event." Drathai said nothing for 8 seconds. "And if I don't," he said. Crow said, "Commander, we haven't fired a single weapon. Think about why that is." He thought about it. He thought about 1,400 ships and 380 contacts and 44 platforms and the word something hanging unfinished in his communications record from 49 minutes ago. He thought about 47 years of construction he had not known about. He thought about 14 months of prepositioning that he had known about, that had somehow meant nothing, because the humans had been prepositioning for 47 years before that. He thought, "We have accounted for everything." He thought, "We have not accounted for anything at all." "Open the south corridor," he said. On the caretaker's bridge, Dietz heard the order relayed from Pale Anchor. She nodded once to her navigation officer. Column 2 separated slightly, creating a gap 4,000 kilometers wide in the south face of the geometry, wide enough for Korathi capital ships to pass through in single file, not wide enough for any kind of formation. She watched the first Korathi ship begin its approach to the gap. She reached up and straightened the photograph of the dog. The caretaker had never fired its weapons in combat. It did not fire them now. On the Korathi flagship, Veldrathai stood at his tactical display and watched his fleet begin the process of leaving. One ship at a time, through a gap created at a human admiral's order, past 380 ships that had held their positions for 9 minutes without firing a single weapon and were still holding position now, patient and still and completely without drama. He stood there for a long time. He thought about 44 worlds and 9 campaigns and 12 years of architecture and 165 scenarios and 0.003%. He thought, "We were never afraid of them because we thought we understood them." He thought, "We never understood them at all." His fleet admiral appeared at his shoulder. "Commander, the tribunal will want a report." "I know," Drathai said. "What do we tell them?" Drathais looked at the display. At his ships passing, one at a time, through a gap that had not existed 12 minutes ago and would close again when the last one was through. "Tell them," he said, "that we were wrong about the numbers." He did not say which numbers. He did not need to. Elder Nereth Solis watched the engagement record 4 times. She had a private chamber on Conclave Station Aurelius, small, by the standards of tribunal delegates, with a single window of translucent stone that looked out at the stars on the station's quiet side. She had lived in this chamber for 61 years. The window had been looking at the same stars for all of them. She watched the record in silence, the 380 contacts appearing on the outer boundary, the geometry closing in 9 minutes, the 44 platforms orienting, the Korathi fleet holding position for the 31 minutes it took the withdrawal to complete. The gap opening, the ships passing through, one at a time, with the particular orderliness of a species that had been told exactly how to leave and had accepted exactly those terms. The last Korathi ship cleared the boundary at 5:12 station time. The gap closed. The 380 contacts held position for 4 more minutes. Then they began, quietly and without broadcast, to disperse back to their prepositioned locations. She watched the dispersal. She thought about what it meant that the Black War Fleet had pre-existed the tribunal's ultimatum. Not by days or weeks, not by the 14 months of Korathi staging, by 47 years. She thought about the 12 infrastructure programs. She thought about the 6 dispersed construction yards in the dark between planetary systems. She thought they built this before most of the current tribunal delegates were born. She thought they built this before Veldrathis took his first world. She thought they were waiting, and they were patient, and they were quiet, and when the waiting was over, they were already done. Her door chimed, she said, "Come." It was the young Valith observer, the 34-year-old junior delegate who had sent her the 3-word message during the engagement. His name was Tavar Sen. He had been standing outside her door for 22 minutes, she suspected, working up the decision to knock. "Elder," he said, "I have questions." "I know," she said, "sit down." He sat in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a moment. "How did they build that without anyone knowing?" "They were careful," she said, "and they were patient, and they understood that the best thing they could do was give everyone who might be watching them nothing worth watching." "For 47 years," he said. "For 47 years," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been reading the tribunal's absorption records," he said. "The species that were absorbed, the ones that complied, and the ones that didn't, none of them did what Earth did. None of them prepared before they had a reason to." "No," Narath Solus said, "they didn't." "Why did Earth?" She looked at the window, at the stars on the station's quiet side, the ones she had been looking at for 61 years. "Because," she said, "they had been reading the tribunal's absorption records too. They started 47 years ago. They looked at every species that had been given an ultimatum, and they looked at what those species had in common, and they made a decision. They decided that if it ever came, it would come fast, and it would come certain of itself, and the only correct response was to be ready before it arrived." She paused. "That's not what most species think when they join an institution like the tribunal. Most species think, we are part of something larger now, we are protected. They thought, we are now a potential target, let us behave accordingly." Tavar Sen was quiet for a long time. "They never fired," he said finally. "No," she said. "Why not?" Narath Solus looked at him. She was 580 years old. She had watched 7 species stand at that platform and present their certainty. She had voted no 7 times, and she had watched all 7 of those certainties end. "Because they didn't need to," she said. "They built something that wins without fighting, not because they're incapable of fighting, because they understood that winning without fighting is always worth more. A fleet that never fires is a fleet that hasn't shown you what it can do. A fleet that never fires is a fleet that will be there the next time. A fleet that never fires is..." She stopped. She thought about how to finish the sentence. "A fleet that never fires," she said finally, "is a message." On Earth Defense Station Pale Anchor, Admiral Senna Crow was drinking coffee in the same folding chair in the same room that smelled like recycled air and cold iron. The tactical display on the east wall was showing the outer system returning to its normal pattern. The relay network was quiet. The dispersal was complete. Commander Oduya appeared in the doorway. He had a mug of his own. "Tribunal's convening an emergency session," he said. "Word is, Drathai submitted a full report. They're calling it a catastrophic intelligence failure." "It was," Crow said. "Stillwater goes public now, I assume." "Some of it." He stood there for a moment. "Do you think they'll try again?" Crow considered the question. She looked at the tactical display. At the outer system, which looked exactly as quiet as it had always looked to anyone watching it from outside. "Not Drathai's," she said. "Not with this information, someone else maybe, eventually." She paused. "That's why we don't take the fleet down." Oduya nodded. He didn't say anything else. After a moment he left, and Crow sat alone in the room with her coffee. 3 months later, on the tribunal's memorial wall, a long stretch of pale stone on the station's inner ring, where the names of every species that had served the tribunal and the individuals who had shaped its history were recorded, a small addition was made. It was not announced. No ceremony was held. A technician was simply given a notation and a location on the wall and asked to inscribe it. The notation was 4 words, placed at the end of the Earth entry, below the date of Earth's admission to the tribunal and above the blank space left for whatever came next. "Advise, do not provoke." LT Specialist Rana Fell heard about the Stillwater outcome from a station-wide message the same morning it concluded. She was at her signals post on the edge of Jupiter's shadow, drinking tea from a battered metal cup that had been her mother's. She read the message twice. She set it down. She looked out the porthole at the outer system. It looked the same as it always had. That was, she understood now, entirely the point. In the years that followed, different species in the tribunal remembered this event differently. The Korathi remembered it as an intelligence failure and a tactical miscalculation. The Fenari remembered it as a diplomatic incident they had been obliged to authorize. The smaller species, the ones who had watched from the gallery of the Great Hall as Veldrathis presented his certainty and received his authorization, they remembered it differently. The Valith remembered it as proof of something Narath Solus had been saying for 61 years. The Tessari remembered it as the day the math changed. The Balasi, who had no particular tradition of war and no particular tradition of peace, but a very long tradition of watching the larger species and deciding who to trust, simply updated their records. In their internal documentation, in the field marked Species Classification for Earth, they changed one word. The word had been minor. The word it became was noted. Narath Solus lived for another 40 years. She served as Valith senior delegate for the rest of her life. She never again voted no on a resolution concerning Earth. Not because Earth never needed defending, but because Earth had demonstrated that it was not a species that required defending. When she was very old, 620 years, the oldest Valith in recorded history, a young delegate asked her what she had known about Earth before the Stillwater engagement. What had made her vote no in that chamber, against 387 other votes without explanation? She thought about it for a long time. I didn't know anything, she said. I knew one thing: they had been quiet for a very long time, and a species that stays quiet for a long time in this galaxy either has nothing worth saying, she paused, or has been saying it in a language the rest of us weren't listening for. She died 3 months later. Her final notation in the Valith delegate records read simply, voted correctly. On Conclave Station Aurelius, in the Great Hall, the pale moon rock dome was still 300 meters overhead. The air still carried the sharp chemical tang of 61 different breathing mixes. The cold stars were still visible through the translucent ceiling. Earth's seat was occupied by a new delegate. He was 38 years old and had short, dark hair and a quiet face. He had been in Earth Unified Command for 14 years before this posting. He carried nothing visible that identified him as a military officer. He sat in his seat and watched the proceedings and said very little. He said everything the tribunal needed to hear. They never fired, they didn't need to. That was the truth, and it was also something else. A fact so quiet, so complete, and so patient that it sat in the chamber like the 380 ships had sat in the outer system. In position and waiting and already done.